first video in our adult series is all about information overload, and I've titled it adult, but it's important to remember that this is going to apply to anyone of any age, and it's a matter that we need to help create awareness that there are a lot of adults with sensory processing difficulties who are already regulating themselves or coping or managing within an environment for themselves, but there's also some people who aren't, and we need to be able to recognise how can we support them so that they can come into work and be able to work for longer, or how can they enjoy that cup of tea or that cup of coffee or whatever it is you're doing a little bit better. So the first one's about information overload, and this is a really important topic to be aware of. And so we're going to talk about it in relationship to work. So when we think about at work, most office-based jobs, we're going to be constantly surrounded by information, whether it's instructions for us to do things, whether it's tasks, whether it's emails, whether it's passing on information, whether it's phone calls, whether it's just having that social conversation with others. We're passing over information constantly. So for people who are hypersensitive to visual information, so they've got really maybe low threshold, a low amount of information that they can take in before being overwhelmed, lots of those ways that we take in information are visual. So an email is visual, notes is visual, having social conversations is visual, because we're reading so much about our faces and body language and gestures. But also it's the auditory. So if you think if someone's hypersensitive to sound, I'm having conversations, that's auditory, but it's information. I have to try and attach meaning to what's being said. Am I supposed to follow through with something? Do I have an instruction from that? So it's not just the act of listening, it's the act of being able to take out the information that's important and relevant to my situation right now. Phone calls, just other sounds happening in the environment, other conversations that are happening in the environment, and also recognising environmental sounds, what are important and what are not important to my specific work situation. So it's very easy for us to be overwhelmed with information. I know many young people that their strategy of coping is by using their mobile phone, so everything will be contained in there. Any other information is just not processed or taken in as effectively, so they can rely on their phone to remind them for things, to have conversations, to have text messages, to send emails. All the information which they pass is on their phone. As soon as there's something written down on paper, as soon as there's something printed out, that information is harder for them to be able to relate into what's important, because it's then crossing over, it's adding in another aspect of information which can quite easily overwhelm. So try and recognise what strategy can you support the person in your office or who you work with best. Ask them, do they prefer having phone conversations and for themselves writing down their instructions or tasks? Do they prefer being sent everything via email? So maybe you have a conversation, but then everything's backed up with that email which still lists everything that you've mentioned on the phone. Many people are already regulating and coping and finding strategies for themselves. So ask the people that you work with, if they have sensory processing difficulties, which method of information do they prefer to use, and how can they identify if something's becoming a bit overwhelming? What would they like to be seen? How would they like to be supported if that does happen?